Well, sometimes technology fails us, and this is one of those times. So I recorded my Bible study for chapter 7 like I normally do, and for some reason the sound died about 7 or 8 minutes in and didn't work at all. So I get to give it another shot now, which is not the most exciting thing, but we do what we can. So we were discussing last time, we're in the Gospel of Mark, we're approaching chapter 7 and the height of the Gospel, Peter's declaration that Jesus is the Christ. And there's been some questions churning in the background of the Gospel. We've spent some time with them, but I think it's important to bring them to the surface now because they come up repeatedly again and again. And they're important themes, maybe even one could say why the Gospels themselves were written, to answer some of these great questions. The first one, and the most important one, is who is Jesus? The Gospel of Mark answers this in the very first verse. The Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Jesus is the Son of God. He's the divine Lord of creation. He is the eternal and universal God. But the story is also one of discovery, that in the midst of the story of the gospel, in the midst of the text itself, there's this question that comes up repeatedly: who is Jesus? And over time, the answer develops a little bit. There's nuance to it. Oddly enough, the disciples usually aren't the ones to understand it very well right away. It's the common people, it's the crowds, or as I've mentioned many times, it's actually the demons that get the answer right consistently, and not the apostles, at least in the Gospel of Mark. So who is Jesus? The first of the great questions. The second one is hard to put exactly into words, but I would ask it like this: what is the worship that Jesus brings? Christianity marks an important transition away from the Jewish temple in Judaism. There is something fundamentally and foundationally different about life as a Christian, that we have a sacramental system, we have the church, we don't offer the sacrifice of animals on our altars to God anymore. And so one of the themes that reoccurs in the gospel continually is this theme of worship. The worship that Jesus brings, what it means to worship Him, what it means to follow God, how we do this, how it's connected, how it's a part of the covenant. All of these things put together surround this question of worship. And it really is at the heart of the gospel. We hear continually these different stories that describe ways that people begin to worship Jesus, or that they come and worship Him. Or some of the text and the words that are used, like this person threw themselves down before Jesus. In English, we don't get the full impact of those words because the Greek is something much more like they prostrated themselves. I think the word is proskunesin. But it means the kind of prostration that's a physical sign of worship. Kind of prostration you find in some different rituals today, in things like the penitential canon of St. Andrew that the Orthodox pray, or in the Muslim world, that's the kind of gesture, bowing all the way down with your head and your arms to the ground. That's a gesture that's reserved for God alone. And oddly enough, it's the word that's used repeatedly in the Gospels at various points. It shows up a few times in the Gospel of Mark, it shows up just as much in the Gospel of John, if not more. But the question of this worship of the new covenant is central to the life of Jesus. So who is Jesus? What does worshiping look like? What does worship in the church look like? And the third question is, who is part of His family? Who is part of the family of God? What does it mean to be a part of the family of God? And the context of this question is important, because the Gospels are written to a Greek and Jewish world, to a world where Jews and Christians often find themselves on the opposite side of issues. Because the Jewish people, the Jewish mind, separates the world into two categories, those who are Jewish and those who are Gentile. And if you're Jewish, you're born Jewish. You're Jewish because your father, your parents, or your mother, or however you want to reckon descent, was Jewish. Jewish faith isn't very evangelical. It's not so much to be spread. They kind of lost sight of that. Christian faith, on the other hand, is evangelical from the very beginning. But this is one of the primary hallmarks, and one of the questions that rages at the center of the Gospels. What does it mean to be fundamentally Jewish? What is it to be a part of the family of God? And the Gospels answer this in a different way than we would expect, at least on the surface. Because, to a certain extent, we would say, well, to be Jewish means to have been born Jewish, to be practicing Judaism. And that's not a bad place to start. But Jesus takes the question much further. For instance, in today's lesson, in a little bit in our study, we'll encounter the woman from Tyre and Sidon, the Syrophoenician woman, who comes to Jesus about the healing of her daughter. And it's this famous story, there's lots of details, Jesus seems to put her off. But at the end of the story, her faith is praised. She is remembered for generations as this woman of faith. This woman who lived as a true child of Israel, as a true child of Abraham. Because she did what Abraham did, she put her faith in God, even though faith looked a little bit different than was expected at the beginning of the story. Or even though faith would look a little bit different for a Gentile than a fully developed Christian. But she puts her faith in God. She puts her faith in Jesus. And I think the gospel claims her as part of his family. And it's not a debate in the same way that we have today. We don't have the same animosity between Judaism and Christianity, certainly. But in the early centuries, this was a pressing question. And I think that the Gospels are at pains to go in the direction that St. Paul does, that it doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or Greek. What matters, in a sense, is whether you're children of Abraham and children of Moses, whether you live in the covenant, whether you love God, whether you're faithful in your heart, whether you follow him. Your physical descent isn't that important. So this is one of the last of the great questions. Maybe it's not as important as the other two, but these questions kind of form recurring themes in the midst of the gospel, and they're important to keep in mind. Because, like we've been discussing all along, the different miracles are miracles that Jesus does, and they're for other people. But they also reveal a lot about him. They tell us about who Jesus is, and what he's coming to do. So our first section, these are verses 1 through 8 of chapter 7, clean hands and distant hearts. The Pharisees and the scribes show up again. What's fascinating is they've been basically absent from the story since the beginning of the gospel. In chapter 1, we encounter them and Jesus gets into a fight because he heals a man on the Sabbath. The Pharisees don't like this. They start attributing to him the working through the power of the devil. They throw him out of the synagogue. He's forced to preach in public places. So he's been doing that for a while. Now the Pharisees come back onto the scene, and these aren't just Pharisees from Galilee. These are Pharisees from Jerusalem. It's like they've called in the cavalry. There's difficulties here. This preacher is causing problems. He's not listening to us, and he's violating our rules about the Sabbath. People are going after him. So they call in the bigwigs from Jerusalem. And they're kind of not approaching Jesus from the same perspective as the crowds. In these coming stories, there's this fascinating parallel that's set up between the crowds who are approaching Jesus as someone doing miracles and maybe developing the idea that this man is more. There's the disciples who are skeptical. They don't seem to get the picture all that well. They're going to struggle, but they're on the road and Jesus loves them and he works with them. And then there's the Pharisees, who approach Jesus as an antagonist. They are against him. It's heads I win, tails you lose, or a zero-sum game. No one is going to come out ahead. It means if the Pharisees are going to win the battle, then Jesus is going down. Jesus wins the battle, then the Pharisees are going to lose their authority. So they come to him, and there's a separation in the groups, and it's kind of important to track them through time because they're going to approach Jesus differently. So the Pharisees are plotting to kill Jesus. They're upset. They don't like what he says. And the people are listening to him, but they're on the road. And so the Pharisees ask this question, why do your disciples eat bread with unwashed hands? Why are they violating the tradition of the elders? So in the background of it, the Pharisees have this long tradition that has been established. They claim it goes back to the time of Moses, and it very well might, that they follow an oral law. They follow a method of doing things. They take the 10 Commandments and the commandments of the Old Testament, and they apply them to life. Pharisees are a part of a holiness movement. Their goal is good. Jesus doesn't critique their goal nearly as directly as we would suppose listening to rhetoric in the modern world. He critiques their practice. Their goal is good, to be faithful to the covenant of God, to be holy, to be a people set apart, a people who are living in covenant life with God. But in order to do that, they have all kinds of challenges. So they take the rules of priestly holiness that God had given to Moses at Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus, maybe even some from Deuteronomy, and they apply it to the ordinary people. And so it meant stuff like the priests had to cleanse themselves before they could offer sacrifices in the temple, so that they would be holy, so that they would be ritually clean, and uncleanness wouldn't enter the temple, because uncleanness was like contamination. The Pharisees have taken this idea of cleanliness for the priests, and they've applied it to everyone. So to live by the standards of Pharisaical holiness is to cleanse yourself constantly, because you can then worship God. You can then live in a covenant with Him. Ritual cleanness comes to signify this deeper reality of worship and this reality of morality. That it was thought if you were unclean, you were immoral. So it wasn't just that you had dust from the marketplace on your hands. This was sinful dust that had to be cleansed, or else you weren't worshiping God. You weren't living as a part of the holy people. This causes problems. Because while it sounds like a good plan, and it sounds like something that you could do from the very beginning, you get stuck in the rules. There's so many rules to follow that instead of living in a covenant relationship with God, instead of the love of God being the most important bar none, what becomes most important is following the rules that are set down. And there's so many rules that it takes a lot of energy to try and follow them because it's hard. Jesus' critique of the Pharisees is precisely in this area. Not that the rules or the idea are wrong, but that you've created so many rules that no one who follows them can love God properly. Or that you can follow the rules but actually hate God in your heart. The Pharisees are the example of this, right? They're concerned about washing hands. You could say Jesus is concerned about washing hearts. The Pharisees are concerned about dust from the marketplace while they're plotting to kill Jesus. The contrast is striking. The contrast is dripping. The irony here is unbelievable because their tradition is important, or not important, okay, but they're violating the commandment of God in their heart. That's what Jesus is after. You cannot claim to be a follower of God and someone who's following a holiness movement if you're plotting to kill someone. Those are mutually exclusive. To love God and love your neighbor are the two great tablets of the commandments, according to Jesus. The two greatest commandments. The two hinges, you could say. And the Pharisees are actually violating both. They're not loving God because they're violating one of the 10 commandments, and they're not loving their neighbor, they're plotting to kill him. They also reject the rules of courtesy. At this time, courtesy was something fundamentally important, foundationally important even. That this wasn't something you did to a guest. You wouldn't go up and correct them publicly, or at least this would be bad manners. Not something you would do, particularly in a culture of honor and shame, which ancient Judaism is. The Pharisees want these things to become an act of worship to God, to become an act of worshiping God by following the traditions and the rules that they set out. They just get a little bit mixed up, and they miss the part that worshiping God means loving Him and following His commandments first and foremost. And they didn't do that very well. Jesus, on the other hand, approaches a question from a different direction. And this is at the heart of Christianity. We talked about it in the Gospel of Matthew when we were speaking of the Sermon on the Mount. Because Jesus takes the 10 Commandments that God gives to Moses, and He says, "You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has committed adultery with her in his heart." Jesus is taking the law, taking these 10 Commandments, and applying them to the human heart, which is a much higher standard of morality. Christianity isn't about what you do in the sense of just actions that you do even if you don't want to. That isn't the worst thing in the world, to do the right thing. But in the Christian faith, where your heart is fundamental, foundational to your relationship with God. So if you come to Mass every Sunday and hate God every minute of it and hate your neighbor and think that everyone else is stupid, your heart isn't in the right spot. That's not how Christianity works. Christianity is a religion of the heart. Now you might start there, fair enough. This isn't a line of condemnation, but just that it's ultimately in our hearts that we need salvation, in our hearts where the Holy Spirit needs to work. This is what Jesus wants to do inside of us. And it's not enough to do the physical actions. It's not enough for ancient Jews to just offer the sacrifices. This is my duty. I do my duty. Lord, I have done everything that I could, or I have done everything that you have asked. Now let me go live my life. Leave me alone. Jesus is saying that's actually a corruption of Judaism. Judaism is also a religion of the heart, and you, Pharisees, are not listening to what God has said. That this is about your hearts, and whether your hearts are in love with the Lord or far away from Him. If your hearts are far away from Him, then you're in the wrong spot already. So Jesus wants the worship of the heart. This is in response, or this is part of that second great question. What does it mean to worship God? That it's not enough to worship God with simply traditions alone, or things that you do, or rituals. Those can be good or they can be bad, but they ultimately are meant to be an expression of the love from our hearts. That what is inside comes out. What is inside is made manifest. Then they're truly good. Then we're moving in the right direction. Now, Jesus definitely critiques human traditions, and sometimes people against the Catholic Church will say, well, the Catholics have all these traditions that aren't found in Scripture. And the truth is that many more of them are found in Scripture than we're given credit for. But even still, Jesus isn't critiquing tradition per se, or these ideas per se, as in they're bad in themselves. He's critiquing the disconnect between heart and action. The disconnect between what I believe and what I really feel and what I do. And the Pharisees are the perfect example of it. You cannot claim to believe God and plot to kill your neighbor. That doesn't work. That's what they're doing in the story. And so it's like it's saying, if your religious system allows you to do this, then your religious system is wrong. If you look at the Catholic Church, it's actually very consistent. We have ways that we worship God in our rituals, in the way that we celebrate the sacraments, that is given to us. But that's not the whole of our relationship with Him. Those are celebrations of the covenant that are important and essential. But just like Judaism, personal prayer is another pillar, and it can't exist without those rituals, but those rituals also need the personal prayer. They need the relationship. So we can get caught in this even now. We can get caught in doing things like saying the rosary just to say it and just to get it done, and not paying attention to the words. It can be hard to pay attention to the words. Fair enough. But the more we put in the effort, the more we try and make those words our own and an expression of the love in our heart, the more the grace of God will work in us, because then we're praying in the right direction. Then our heart is in accord with what we're doing otherwise. So then Jesus starts going on the offensive. So the Pharisees have these rules about washing hands, and that's one set of rules. Jesus makes a point, though. You take and nullify the commandments of God for the sake of your human traditions. And he uses the example of dedicating things to the temple. So the ancient Jews seem to have this, or at least the ancient Pharisees, seem to have this idea that you could dedicate things to the temple, that you could dedicate things for temple service. Now, on the face of it, this isn't a bad idea. We still ask for donations today. We're not doing something morally corrupted. We ask for people to support the church because that's important, because it allows us to continue to do the work that God has entrusted to us to do, and to keep the lights on and to pay the bills. But Jesus notes that you have set aside the commandments of God for these human traditions. So you could have a relatively wealthy person, let's say a Pharisee who is a merchant, who decides that they're going to dedicate their whole wealth to God, and now they can no longer take care of their parents. So they're making a distinction between the duty to family and the duty to God that Jesus rejects. Jesus says, you cannot set aside the commandments of God for the sake of your human traditions. So it's a commandment of God himself to honor your father and mother. Part of that is you have a responsibility to care for them. You cannot honor God by dedicating money to him if you reject his commandments. It's kind of the same thing from the last story, that this is a problem. Heart has to go with action. You can't separate them. You can't be an awful child and love God like you should. So he notes that you disregard or you nullify the commandments of God. He's increasing in strength in his rebuke of the Pharisees. At first it was, you have these rules. Now it's you disregard or you nullify. You're casting aside. You're throwing away the commandment of God to satisfy your human tradition. The love of God and the love of neighbor. The love of God and following the commandments, what you believe in your heart, how you act, these go together. That's at the heart of the Christian faith. That's at the heart of true divine worship. The Pharisees are failing to see what is most important and what is less important. The commandments of God, the rules of God himself, are more important than the rules that we make. Worshipping God in spirit and in truth is far more important than the different rules that we make. Now, again, we have to be a little bit careful of this, because sometimes the rules are difficult and we just don't like them. And we don't like them because they're difficult and they challenge us. They call us out of ourselves, they challenge our pride, they kick us in the face. Yes, the rules are difficult. And we might not like them for that reason, but that doesn't mean the rules are bad, it means our hearts are bad. That sin is on the inside, and that's what needs transformation. The rules are meant to teach us to desire what is good, to open our hearts to the goodness of God, to share with him what's in our hearts and what's in our lives. And then the story continues. So there's 3 stories in a row. These first 23 verses of chapter 7 are all about this challenge to the Pharisees. Now comes the earthquake. And Jesus kind of knows it's coming. You have to wonder if he's smiling while he does this, because he calls the people together. He calls the crowd. And he brings them together and he says, "Hear me and understand." Note that this has been a rebuke. The people who hear God but don't really listen to him, the ones who are, the prophets are sent, they hear his words and they reject them in their hearts. Now he says, "Hear me and understand." He's making a solemn pronouncement. And he does something, when he says, hear me and understand, this is weird, right? The rabbis in ancient Judaism don't talk like this. The Pharisaical rabbis don't pretend to give definitive interpretations of the law. They have debates. You can still find those debates recorded in the Talmud. It's kind of strange to Christian ears because it'll say like one rabbi says this and another rabbi says that. It doesn't really tell you the answer or which one's the best. That somehow the answer is found in the midst of the debate. Jesus approaches this differently. He stands up and he very clearly is going to give a kind of definitive interpretation. He's going to say, this is what it means. And in doing so, he rips to shreds many Pharisaical traditions about the Old Testament. Because he says defilement is not what comes from outside. The things from outside, the dust from the marketplace, eating food with Gentiles, the kinds of food that you eat, those are not what defile one. What defiles a person comes from the heart. It comes from the inside. The food you eat, you consume and it leaves your body. It goes out. That cannot defile a person. That's a natural process. It's biology. It's given to us by God. On the other hand, what comes from inside out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. From our hearts come wickedness and evil and all kinds of things. Those are what defile. With this statement, Jesus just dropped a bomb into ancient Judaism. And you can see the impact of this because even the disciples pull him aside and they're like, Lord, what? You can't mean this. You just chucked a huge amount of Old Testament ceremonial law that was given to us by God. Jesus says now the purpose of the ceremonial law is revealed in him, in this way of life that he's describing in the sacramental system of the church. That it's not these things that came from outside that caused the problems. It was your stubborn hearts. It was that you didn't love God. Look at the story of the Old Testament, the story of Israel in the desert. The problem wasn't the desert dirt. The problem was the people's hearts. The problem wasn't the land of Egypt as a physical place, but pagan worship in the heart. Jesus reinterprets, he rediscovers or reproposes a huge amount of ancient Judaism in this. And I think, this is just something that I've thought for a long time, but I think that he's actually claiming that this is what Judaism was about all along. And it kind of got lost. The Christians never claim that they stopped being Jewish. The Christians claim to be the fulfillment of the Old Testament. That this is what the Old Testament was leaning toward. It was a group of Jewish rabbis who finally looked at the early Christian community 70 years or so, 50 years maybe, after the life of Jesus, and threw the Christians out of the synagogue saying, you're not Jewish. The Gospels actually claim the opposite. They look at the Pharisees and they say, you're not Jewish. You've lost what is most important. You've lost what is essential. Jesus is building an understanding of the new covenant that's founded on the heart. And this is so essential and so powerful and so fantastically difficult that just drives us bonkers. Right? Because it's much easier to say, I follow the commandments of God. I have not killed anyone. It's much harder to say, I have not been angry with someone in my heart. Yep, done that, been there. That happens every single day. There's quite a list of sins that is given out at the end of this. Evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness or lust, envy, blasphemy, evil speech, arrogance, and folly. I bet all of us have done some of those even today. Even so far in this day. Like, the standard isn't lowered. The standard is dramatically raised. This is dramatically more difficult. In fact, only possible through the grace of the Holy Spirit that works inside of us, that works in the human heart. But this is a much higher standard. Jesus is saying The Gospel of Mark even points this out. With this, he declared all foods to be clean. Like, the old ceremonial law is gone. Something has changed, and he has added himself. He has given a definitive interpretation that he intends to be followed, that sets a standard. This is a norm or a foundational piece of what he's trying to accomplish. And it's on this level that the interior must match the exterior, that what we're doing in our hearts, what we believe in our hearts, is as important as what we do. Believing rightly, living rightly, working on that sanctification of the human heart. That's where it begins, that's where it ends. This is what is in need of salvation. And sometimes it stinks. Like, this is hard work. It's not an easy thing. This is why Jesus gave us a sacrament of confession, because we're not good at this. If you think you are, it's like you have to hit the reset button and start over. And I can say that most profoundly for myself, that I'm not good at this. It's so easy to get caught up in other things. But the worship of the heart is what we're meant for, what we're made for, that our hearts actually begin to love the Lord. Even the apostles are scandalized. They question Jesus. This is kind of funny, right? Because we would think of the apostles as being the ones who get the answer right. They're the closest to Jesus. They are the ones who listen to him the longest. And they're like, wait a minute. What did you say? What did you do? Are you sure? This is hard. They're coming along for the ride, but they're not all the way there yet. They don't have it all figured out. Jesus is this lawgiver who is interpreting things in a way that has never been done before. So then Jesus leaves. He's provoked the Pharisees. He's given a new understanding and a new teaching. He's developing this new covenant idea. Then he goes west to Tyre and Sidon. And Tyre and Sidon are Gentile cities. They're north even of modern-day Israel, probably in the country of Lebanon near the modern-day city of Beirut. This is a journey of like 40 miles, a journey that takes some time. This isn't just an easy road, so he may spend 5 days or a week with his apostles on the way there. Maybe it's not quite that long, but this story is important. Jesus is looking for fruit from the Jewish people, and he's not finding it. He starts to go to the Gentiles. And this is one of these things where the story is actually kind of strange, because it doesn't tell you where Jesus stayed. It doesn't tell you where he ate. There's all kinds of details that are necessary in the story, like it's Tyre and Sidon, so he can't just show up, and live on the street, or at least we don't think he did. He may have for a day or two. Maybe he had some friends there, maybe he was staying with them, but somehow a Syrophoenician woman hears about him being there, and she comes to him. She comes to him, and there's this rather strange scene, because she asks him for a healing, and Jesus said it is not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs. This is playing into the age-old conflict between the Jews and the Gentiles. That on the one hand, there's the Jewish people who are faithful to God. The Gentiles have abandoned it. They are not part of the family of Judaism. But the Gospels have a little bit different idea. It says Jesus came to seek and to save the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Who is part of this house of Israel? And then you have the story of the Syrophoenician woman. So she asks Jesus for the healing. Jesus seems to say no. And then she comes out with this bold statement, even the dogs eat the scraps from the table of their masters. Even the dogs are a part of the family. Even the dogs belong. Now, dogs, unlike in the modern world, were not highly thought of in the ancient Jewish faith. Dogs were primarily scavengers. They lived outside of town. They were probably unclean because they ate all kinds of things. including dead ones. Dogs have never been, at least as their domesticated form, they've never been quite as adept at killing and hunting things as cats are. Cats can figure it out, but dogs usually don't. They scrounge and scavenge and eat food that's discarded by other things. So this is the context, and Jesus says, let the children be fed first, and she claims that even the dogs are a part of the family. The time is coming when the whole world is reinvited into the covenant with David. You see, that was its purpose from the beginning. Jesus is going back to that. That the covenant with David was that the Jewish people were meant to be a light to the nations, was meant to be a city set on a hill. There's a courtyard of the Gentiles where the Gentiles are supposed to come and pray because of the witness of the Jewish people, that the Jewish people witness to how God is at work in their lives and they reveal His work. And this is so good that the Gentiles are drawn into worship of God. It kind of didn't work. The Jewish people become the Gentiles, are cast out, they're hated, they're corrupt, they're polluted, we can't be a part of them. And so they kind of throw them out. And Jesus is reclaiming actually what is at the heart of the Davidic covenant. That this is a covenant for the whole world. And something happens here that is earth-shattering, that is so easy to miss in English. And so important. This woman calls Jesus Lord. Kurios. Kurios is the word that was used in the Septuagint when God reveals Himself in the burning bush. I am who am. Think about the impact in the gospel, what we've been talking about literarily for so long. It's been developing. Jesus is the Son of God. There's John the Baptist. There's a story of the apostles and the healing. And this question about who He is has been swirling around. And the Pharisees have been challenging Him because He rejects their traditions, even though they claim to be the children of Israel. And the first person to utter the words in the Gospel of Mark is a Gentile woman that it sounds like Jesus is rejecting. She calls Him Lord. Kurios. You have to feel the weight of some of these moments, or it's so easy to miss a part of this story. It just took the entire Jewish world and flipped it on its head, because she's revealed as someone who is a true child of Israel, a true child of God. She's living like Abraham did in faith, and her faith sees Jesus as Lord. The apostles haven't done that yet. The demons haven't done that yet. They've called Him the Holy One of God. Okay, maybe it's a divine title. But she calls Him Lord. It sounds like Jesus is kind of hard on her. But the reality is that she is remembered forever. Her story is recorded in the Scriptures. She calls Him Lord. Now you see, in a sense, the strength of her faith. And she's praised by Jesus, right? Her faith is commended. He doesn't commend the faith of the apostles. He doesn't commend the faith of the Pharisees. They actually believe what Jesus says, they just don't like it. But He commends the faith of the woman. That's where you want to be in the gospel. When God Himself looks at your faith and marvels at it, then you're living a life of faith. Then you're a child of Abraham. And so she reveals herself as a part of the family of God. As someone that Jesus was sent to call home. She's in this. And so Jesus does this miracle for her from a distance. He doesn't even need to be present. He doesn't need to lay hands. He says, let it be done. And it is done. He utters a divine word, like at the beginning of creation, and it goes forth from His mouth, and it accomplishes what it intended. He draws out her faith. So she's not a part of the Jewish people by physical birth. She's Gentile. But she is a part of the Jewish people in faith. That fits with exactly what St. Paul says. That it no longer matters whether you're Jew or Greek, that we're all part of the same family. We're all children of Abraham. We're all called to faithful life in the covenant with God. Jesus reveals himself to be the new Messiah, the new shepherd, the King of Israel, the true King of Israel who's gathering people together, who's calling the lost sheep home to a covenant with him. And this is profound. This is part of what this story means. And again, we have to be a little bit careful because a lot of these things are probably paradigmatic. They're a pattern. They establish a way of relating to Jesus because they only happen once. This story is recorded once. This one Gentile woman from Tyre and Sidon. Did he only talk to one person while he was there? I doubt it. I mean, he spends practically the entire time in the rest of the Gospels teaching and healing and doing miracles. The people chase him down. They can't get enough of what he said. They break down the door. They hardly leave him alone. Several times it's like he doesn't even have enough to eat. He doesn't have time to eat because the people won't leave him alone. Did they leave him alone in Tyre and Sidon? I doubt it. It's hard to imagine. I mean, maybe he didn't preach as publicly in some of it, but she, the true child of Abraham, found him. Those who seek find. To the one who knocks, the door will be opened. And Jesus is not rejecting anyone who comes to him, even if they're outside of the bounds of the traditional Jewish faith. The gates are open to everyone. Last section. So then Jesus goes to the region called the Decapolis. The last time we were there, Jesus had healed the demoniac of the Gadarenes near the tombs, and the pigs rushed down into the sea and they all drowned. And the people told Jesus to leave. They kind of threw him out of their area. They were concerned, their livelihood was ruined. Their response makes some sense. And then he goes back, and he goes back now. And it says he goes back by way of Sidon. So he must have gone to the north and then gone to the east to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. This again is a long journey, longer than the journey from where he was to Tyre, where he meets the Syrophoenician woman. So he takes a journey, maybe of some days, of some weeks. He may stop on the way, but he ends up back over in the Decapolis, the 10 Greek cities on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. And they bring him someone who is deaf. They see he's coming, and immediately the people start to come to him. They bring him someone who is ill. And there's a fascinating corollary here. They bring him someone who is deaf, someone who is blind. The corollary comes from the Old Testament in the book of Isaiah, chapter 35, that in the wilderness God reveals his glory in the wild places. And he talks about making the blind see and the mute speak and the deaf hear. That hearts are being opened, eyes are being opened. So on one level there's a cure and a miracle. On another level, these miracle stories, as they build on each other, are the gradual opening of the eyes and the hearts and the minds and the ears of the disciples to hear what Jesus is saying. They're the opening of our hearts and our minds to hear the message of the gospel. Jesus takes this man away, and he heals him by spitting on the ground and making mud and rubbing it on his eyes and touching, I think, his tongue, and he breathes on him. He does these different kind of things, and it's very physical. It's very direct for the man. These are things that you can touch and feel. They're just like our sacraments today. They're things that you can hear and see. You taste the Holy Eucharist. You feel the oil on your head. You can smell the chrism when a child is anointed at baptism. Jesus is not afraid of the physical stuff. He has a human body. He has a human nature. And he uses his human nature to be a channel for his grace, to reveal his glory. So this is through the sacramental system. It points to the priesthood, that today he uses the body of a priest, the physical nature of a priest, to reveal his glory, to act in the same way, to act in the sacraments, to act in prayer, to bring healing to people who need it, to restore sight to the blind, to help the deaf hear. He says a word. After he groans, he looks up to heaven and he says, Ephatha, which is kind of a funny word. It's still preserved in the rite of baptism, and it means be opened. I think it's from the language called Aramaic. But this word is operative. This word does something. When Jesus says it, it happens. You know, we live in North Dakota, and you could go outside and you could say all winter long, you could proclaim to the snowbank, I command you to be warm. Be warmed, right? It's still winter. Hasn't worked yet. Probably won't work. I mean, I think God could do it, but he usually doesn't do something like that to break the rules of nature that it operates by, usually completely. But in this case, the word of Jesus accomplishes what he means it to. He says it, and it happens. And that's something profoundly true. That's something profoundly beautiful. Because it harkens back to the words of creation. That at the very beginning of the book of Genesis, God says, let there be light. And there was light. Here Jesus says, be opened. And it's opened. He says to the demons, be gone. And they leave. His words are operative. And in this case, it's another mission to the Gentiles. The Decapolis are the Greek cities. He goes over to the Greek cities, and again, the crowds are welcoming him with joy. The people are bringing him people. Their hearts are being opened to the truth that Jesus is the divine Son of God. And these are hallmark moments. That the Jews are invited first. They're not bearing fruit, at least the leadership of ancient Judaism, some of the Pharisees. I guess it is important to reiterate that many of these do follow Jesus. Many of the first Christians were from these movements, so it's probably not fair to say that they all reject him, but that many do, that some, especially those who were on top, who felt threatened, do. And he goes to them first. He is rejected, at least by some. They don't receive him. They don't claim him for their Messiah. And now he goes to the Gentiles, and we have two stories in a row of how the Gentiles are recognizing him as the Son of God. The woman called him Kurios. Here, this blind man, his eyes are opened. He can see Jesus. The glory of God is revealed in the person of Christ standing in front of him. Jesus is accomplishing the work of the Messiah. And my hope is that you can see how the story's been building. At the beginning, it's huge. Jesus is this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Jesus is the divine Son of God. And then we dive into the story, and it's like this divine nature of Jesus gets hidden for a time. The people are starting to wonder, they're asking questions, he multiplies the loaves, things that are curious are happening, and then they start to remember the passages in the Old Testament about the Messiah. When the Messiah comes, he will bring sight to the blind, he will open the ears of the deaf. In the wilderness they will encounter God. And then Jesus goes to the wilderness and he brings sight to the blind and hearing to the deaf. And his glory is revealed and manifested, and is to the Gentiles. So in the Gospel of Mark, if this was a piece of music, we'd say we're in the crescendo. It's reaching a height, the moment of fortissimo, the loudest part where Peter will declare that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. From that moment, Jesus will set his heart and mind toward Jerusalem, and he will go. We're almost there. The tension in the story has been building. He provoked the Pharisees today with this extended commentary and conflict on the life of the Pharisees. Then he goes to save the lost sheep of the house of Israel, who were so lost for so long that they're called Gentiles. They don't even know it. And he meets with great success. And then he will go with his apostles, where they will declare that he is the Christ. It's a great privilege to you to study the Gospels together. For next time, we'll look at the first part of chapter 8. There's kind of two pieces, and so we'll look at the first part of chapter 8 because the second part goes with chapter 9 in our commentary book, and that would be too much material to accomplish in 1 week. I'm quite certain of that. So for next week, we'll look at chapter 8. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you soon.